we have here Professor Jeremiah Alberg from International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. And I would like to start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard? Okay. And how did you encounter him after you heard about him?
So I somehow managed to go all the way through my education, including a doctorate in Germany, without ever hearing the name René Girard. And I was, at the time, I was a member of the Society of Jesus, a Jesuit. And after the doctorate, I went to the final phase of training of the Jesuits called tertianship in Manila in the Philippines. And a very dear and close friend of mine was also part of that program. And he brought with him 2 cassette tapes by Gil Bailey, again, someone I had never heard of. And so I listened to them. And in those tapes, the name René Girard kept coming up. And what interested me at the time very much was, although my degree was in philosophy, as a Christian and also as a priest, I had for myself a question. It had also been asked by people, why is God so violent in the Old Testament? And I realized I didn't have any satisfactory answer, either for myself or for others. So I was kind of looking for something that might help me to understand that. And Gil's approach did that. It really helped me a lot. But it was clear to me that it was based on René's thought. And so I went right then to the library where we were at, the Ateneo. It's a university in Manila. And the only book they had was Violence in the Sacred. So I checked it out and I read it. And I just remember thinking, I just don't get this. I don't see how this is connected to the Old Testament and to violence and scriptures and things like that. And but I kept hearing things from Gil that made me think that René's thought had to be important. So I think the next book I got was Things Hidden. And that's when it just really opened up for me. It really started to make a lot of sense. And then I went through and read the corpus at that point. And so I was very excited about it. And I felt it was helping me a lot. And I returned to Japan from the Philippines. I started my teaching career. And as I was teaching, I was using more and more of René's thought, and in particular, the idea of his approach to anthropology and things like that. At the same time, I was reading a lot of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So from my dissertation, part of my dissertation had been about Rousseau, and I didn't feel that I had really understood him. So I was rereading him with the hope of eventually writing something on him. And so if you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau and René Girard at the same time, there are obvious places where they come together, and then places where I found Girard's approach very illuminating for understanding the text of Jean-Jacques of Rousseau. And in particular, I found the notion of scandal to be really helpful. And it was something that I didn't think anyone else had paid much attention to in Rousseau's writing. And in fact, it's really massively present in certain writings. And then even in those where it's not so present, it's still there in the sense that he was just sort of a scandalous person. So I ended up writing a paper on the first discourse, the discourse on the arts and sciences in Scandal, and it was published, and I sent that to René. So that was my first contact, and I got an answer back from
What year
him.
was that?
1999 or 2000.
Okay.
So I started reading him in 1993. That would have been when I was in the Philippines, 93, 94. And I didn't write anything using him until 1999. And although I'd had some contact with Gil in the meantime, I hadn't had any direct contact with René. So the first thing I heard directly from him was a short note from him thanking me for it and saying it was interesting, and then saying if I ever came to the United States to please look him up, and giving me his phone number. And so I was coming up on a sabbatical at that point, and I was going to, I actually worked it out that I could go to Santa Clara University, which is just about 20 minutes away from Stanford. And so through that, I was able to begin participating in these twice a month seminars that Robert Hamilton Kelly organized on the Stanford campus. And I gave a paper there. And for the next, I think, almost 2 years, was more or less a regular participant in those meetings.
What is your favorite book of René's?
Yeah, as other people often say, it's the one I'm reading. But I suppose on the one hand, for the most comprehensive view of it, it remains Things Hidden. I really love that book. But if I just want to pick up something and sort of be edified, I somehow the book on Dostoevsky really, there are just passages in it that I think are they're very spiritually uplifting, or else they're spiritually humiliating in a good sense. That the notion of pride and what pride does to us, I find very
This
just
is the book
helpful.
that Jim Williams translated into
Yeah,
English.
yeah, yeah.
What are your thoughts on his last book, Battling to the End?
When it came out, first of all, I read French, but I don't, I'm not really fluent in it. And so I try to work through some of the French, and I don't feel like I'm quite getting it. And I was listening to other people at the time, and I just didn't feel that I understood it. And so then the English translation came out, and I worked through it more carefully, more slowly. And I was blown away by it, partly because, in my own opinion, I felt like I felt like I Saw Satan Fall didn't really break any new ground. That it was simply a different presentation of a lot of things that had gone before it. In some ways, a very good presentation. And so to be perfectly honest, I wasn't expecting anything new. And then you read this book, and it just, and I was with him some of the time that he would have been composing this book, and right, he never talked about Clausewitz. I mean, at least I don't remember anything about Clausewitz. So in many ways, it was kind of a shock in that sense, that boy, he's still got some more to say. And for me, I, I used it then to write something again on Rousseau's letter to D'Alembert, the letter on the theater. And what I found at first just helpful was the notion of achevé, of completing someone, that it requires that you read them from this mimetic viewpoint. and that's how he was going to read Clausewitz, and that's how I was trying to read Rousseau. And I can't list it all, but he had like 3 steps in what he means by achever. And I found that to be a very helpful methodological approach to reading an author. Now, when you get into the actual content, uh, I will still find quotes from other people, especially people who are criticizing it, that do shock me a little bit. It's like, I don't even remember reading that. About withdrawal, for instance, that there seems to be a very heavy emphasis in Girard at this point of kind of withdrawing from the world. And I'm not sure that that's the best advice to give to a young person. And so I find it kind of a book that is very Augustinian. It is a book of an older person. And in that sense, it's filled with a lot of wisdom. But I'm also not surprised that some people are either disappointed in it or uh, don't really want to accept some of its conclusions. I think for some of the younger people say, well, wait another 40 years and you're probably more on board with it.
Do you think it is an apocalyptic book? At least that's what he said.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I just read a quote from him recently that something like history has a meaning and its meaning is terrifying.
Right.
Right. And I can understand where a lot of people want to be more optimistic, and want to say, no, we can make things better. And uh, if you're feeling terrified at 20, that's not a particularly
Right.
good thing,
Right.
So, so in that sense, yeah, I do think it's apocalyptic. I think it needs to be taken seriously, but I'm not surprised that there are different takes on it.
Right. Right. So you basically knew Rene from 2000 till when he passed away in 2015,
Yeah.
15 years essentially.
Yeah.
So in these 15 years, let me ask you, did he have an impact on you intellectually, in your thoughts, intellectual thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, the book that I wrote on uh, Rousseau he wrote the foreword to it. It's basically my use of his thought applied to the text of Rousseau. And I found it to be, and this is, aside from the person, if I just talk about, say, mimetic theory in a kind of objective sense, what I found helpful about it is both in terms of the scriptures, but then also in terms of non-canonical writings or secular writings, it opens up text for me. Okay, and in that sense, I find it very powerful. And it's not the only way; it's not the only thing. But for me, it really gets at uh, a basic anthropological reality, namely violence, that I think we just too often turn away from. We don't want to look at it. And Girard's thought helps us to look at it, gives us tools and uh, the conceptual apparatus by which we can handle some of those things. That being said, that's sort of the intellectual approach. And so I continue to use, I'm working on and have been working for a number of years on Kant right now. And I'm just finding more and more mimetic reality in Kant. He's more and more a mimetic thinker than I think anyone has ever guessed, and that's very exciting. And so again, you see new dimensions of a thinker, you see new vistas opening up, you see old things in a new light, things like that. But there's something about Rene's thought for me that also gives me the courage to look at it. So even though I know some people maybe feel like the last book is too dark or something, the man himself was not dark. Rene was not. He was light, light in both senses of the word, illuminating, but also easy to be with. You never, at least I never felt, besides my own initial uh, nervousness and stuff, I never felt from him a heaviness. I always felt very welcomed and, uh, someone who was willing to listen to me and freely comment on what I said without uh, fear or favor, as they say. So it was just very easy to be with him. Uh, so he continues to have an impact on me intellectually, but also, uh, I would say spiritually, you could say personally, in the sense of giving me courage.
How, courage, how so?
Well, as I said, I think we don't want to look at violence. We don't want to face it uh, in ourselves more than anything else, but we also don't want to face it in the text that we read or in the uh, phenomenon, the social phenomenon that we look at. And not just violence. I mean, we don't want to look at envy. We don't want to look at uh,
Rivalry.
rivalry. Yeah, yeah. None of us have any rivals, right? It's that classic sort of thing that we can see rivalry in everybody else. But if you ask me, do I have any rivals? Oh no, no. I'm even struck by Renee's colleagues who will always claim, well, we never had any mimetic rivalry. I'm just like, oh, come on, guys. You know, anyway, it's fine. Uh, we don't want to look at it. And he helps me to be at least a little bit more willing to entertain the possibility that I might also be rivalrous. And that's, I think, very early on, what drew me to his way of thinking was that it was self-implicatory. That is, that it wasn't just about other people. It wasn't about finding scapegoats. It was about trying to deep down identify the way that I scapegoat others. And that's a pretty uncomfortable enterprise. And I would say I've spent much of the time since, uh, first reading him, sort of doing interior work on being more honest about the way I scapegoat or about the way I'm in rivalry. I was talking once with uh, names always just slip out right when I need them. Eric Gans.
Yeah.
And we were like going up in an elevator together or something. We were talking about rivalry, and he said, "Yeah, 2/3 of the time I'm in rivalry with someone." And I said, "Only 2/3." And he said, "Well, I have to sleep sometimes." That's how I feel. It's just an ever-present reality that you keep finding new dimensions of.
What did you think of his Shakespeare book? Did you get a chance to read that book?
I did. I loved it, and that's one of those works I continually find new things in. That there's some jewels on scandal in his analysis of the Twelfth Night, and how or why that works out that way kind of amazes me. But uh, I can go to that book almost any time and just read a few pages and sort of be blown away again by some insight in it. Yeah, it's one of those things where I how would I put it? Uh, it was published by Oxford University Press, so it's not like it didn't get noticed or something. But I am always a little bit disappointed that experts in Shakespeare don't take it more seriously. I think I'm not myself an expert in Shakespeare, but I've read all of his plays, and I've read a fair amount of secondary sources. And uh, the book by Goddard, I think, Harold Goddard, The Meaning of Shakespeare. and Renee's book. Those would be the two books I would choose for reading Shakespeare.
What book of René's would you use to teach?
I've used Scapegoat a lot,
Scapegoat.
and the reason I use it is because he starts with that example from medieval France, the text, King of Navarre,
Mhm.
and the prologue to it, where you get this very straightforward description of the plague and of what happens to the Jews, right? And the person who's writing it believes he's writing the truth. And yet we can read that and see, well, yeah, that there are parts of it that are true, and then there are parts of it that are clearly false. And it's a very, for students, I think, a very easy to grasp exercise to go through this historical text, but to see we don't just take it at face value, we read it critically, and we understand that what's behind this text is some act of violence, mob violence, that then distorts the text in certain predictable ways. And once they kind of get that model, and here in Japan, I can point out to them, I can say, is there do you see know any parallels to something like this? And in 1920, the Great Kanto earthquake, you have the Great Kanto earthquake, you have the crisis, you have the minority, which are Koreans who lived in the Tokyo area. You have rumors about this minority that they poisoned the wells, and then you have violence against minorities. And most of the students know about this. They know about this historical incident. And so it just lines up so precisely that, and then he really just builds the whole book out of that. And so it's this one long argument of just trying to expand that more and more. So let's look at myths. Let's discuss what a myth is in terms of its cultural significance. And I think it gives some believability to the fact that the scapegoat mechanism is a culturally foundational mechanism. And if you can accept all that, and then you say, well, now let's look at the crucifixion and see how that sort of reprises all of these kind of things. It reprises the culturally foundational mechanism, but rather than being a myth, it's a gospel. It exposes it. And I'm teaching in Japan, so I'm teaching a lot of people who aren't Christian, have never even opened the Bible. You start talking about Paul, and their question is, Paul who, right? What's his last name? They just don't know. And so I don't have to ask them to have any presuppositions about faith or anything. It's just, let's just look at these texts and let's look at this argument and see if you accept it. And an awful lot of people are really blown away by it. They're really amazed at the role of violence in culture, the role of violence in our lives, the role of scapegoating in Japanese culture. It's all over the place once they.
Well, you mentioned in our last discussion that the word scapegoat doesn't exist in Japanese. Am I correct?
No, Renee says that at one point in some interview or something, and it's historically true, but just the other day I saw it in print. They used the word scapegoat.
In Japanese?
Yeah.
It does
Scapegoat.
exist.
Yeah. Scapegoat. Yeah. And they have some other expressions for it. So when the scapegoat was translated as, well, it was translated more directly from the French, the émissaire bord. It's translated as the goat that's cast out.
Right.
But they have some other words that are not direct translations that are very close. Like if you say to a Japanese, do you know about hashirabashi, which means the column or support of a bridge, they know what that means, because what it means in Japanese, it isn't talking about the column of the bridge. It's talking about the victim, the young virgin that's buried at the base of that column, because that's what they used to do when they were building bridges. In order to dedicate the bridge, in order to get it built, they sacrificed someone. And so they have cultural concepts that are quite close to scapegoat, or to the sacrificial victim.
And have you managed to teach things hidden?
I have never taught that, no.
Too complicated, probably.
Actually, I think I did once in we teach this is probably not of interest here, but we teach in 10-week terms, like quarters. And a book
Like
like
Stanford. Stanford is quarter also, right?
so a book like Things Hidden is just too much for our students. Although it is translated into Japanese. Almost all of his work, outside of Battling to the End or Asheve Clausewitz, everything has been translated into Japanese.
So which book of his do you use to teach Christianity?
Scapegoat is the I use for the introduction to Christianity. I have used I See Things Fall, or I See Satan Fall.
I see Satan fall like lightning. Yeah.
It, it's also very good, and it's more sort of set up that way. It starts with scandal and with the scriptures. But in a certain sense, for a Japanese audience, again, I find it almost presumes too much.
Okay. You have to be a Christian you have to know your Judeo-Christian text in order to really understand what's going on. Okay. Right. Okay, so in these 15 years, what was you mentioned it, but what was your first interaction with René when you met him?
So, well, my very first one was at this, I gave a paper at Stanford at this seminar, and I won't go into all the details, but it was a very unpleasant experience.
Unpleasant?
Yeah, because
Why?
Bob Hamilton Kelly bit my
Okay.
head off. And so I love Bob, and we became close friends afterwards, but he is a bit of a bully, and
I know that.
he was on display. And I came from Japan. I mean, literally, I had gotten off the plane, gone from the airport to Stanford to give this paper.
Right.
And I was saying a few things, and Bob's put up his hand and said, "Do you mind if I interrupt, if I ask a question?" I said, "No, please feel free." And he said, "Yeah, because you're just sitting there hemming and hawing and not saying anything."
Who?
Bob said that to me.
Right.
You're hemming and hawing and not saying anything.
I see.
And I just was flabbergasted. Is that how you talk to a guest? I mean, in Japan, we just don't do this. I mean, I've been out of the States. I was coming to start a sabbatical in the States. I had not lived in the United States for more than 20 years. So most of that in Japan, 6 of it in Germany. I just wasn't used
Ready
to
for that.
Yeah. And so I kind of shut up, and then someone else finally said, "Well, shouldn't we hear a little bit more from him, because he came all this way to give a paper?" So talked a little bit more, and again, Bob did something, and so about 3 times, and then finally I just realized I needed to stand up to him, and so I did. He said something, and I replied back. He said something like, "Well, that doesn't really matter," and I said, "Well, it doesn't matter if you don't care about spreading the gospel." And that Bob just kind of stared shocked at me, and René said, "He's right."
Who's right?
I'm
What?
right. He said,
You're
no.
right.
Yeah. And
And
it
he
was
took
very
your
quiet.
side.
Yeah. And he just said, "He's right." And that was the first real words I heard from René. And then things went much smoother in the presentation, and it ended up being a very pleasant experience. And I got to know Bob Hamilton Kelly better and understood a little bit more the way he operates. And through that, then after that, I was seeing René on a more regular basis. I'd go out to lunch with him sometimes. Uh, I got, I can't remember the first time exactly, but I got to know Martha then. I started, uh, going to his house on occasion and getting to know Martha as well. Also, starting in 2004, I started to attend Cover and 2003, 2004. Anyway, the Innsbruck conference was the first one I went to. And Martha would always accompany him, and so got to know them through those conferences as well. Uh, I I think I might have mentioned this in the last time. The other thing I was during those years, I was in the process of leaving the Society of Jesus and leaving the priesthood, and it was a difficult time in my own life in a lot of ways. But towards the end of it, I was able to introduce my future wife to them. And my wife is someone who doesn't particularly like academics or doesn't take them very well, but she loved, she really from the very first uh, really appreciated him and was just very, very fond of him. And so after that, when my second child was born, we asked René and Martha to be the godparents, and they agreed to it. And so at that time, we were living in another place. We flew to the Bay Area and had a mass. And Bob Hamilton Kelly and his wife Rosemary drove René and Martha out to Berkeley where the mass was, and we all celebrated the baptism of my daughter. So
Mazel tov, as we say in New York.
yeah,
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
that was very nice. Yeah.
What year was that?
That would have been, she was born 2007 March, so I think it was around Christmas of 2007.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I would imagine you guys stayed in touch after that.
We did, and we would go visit. Even I have some pictures of my children standing beside René. He's sitting. He's ill at the time. I mean, he's already had the strokes and he can't really speak. But we went and visited Martha, showed my daughters around Stanford, and we had a meal with them and things. So we visited him. I visited him a couple times after the strokes when he couldn't really speak, but just spent time with him. And then when he died, I couldn't come to the funeral, but my whole family, so my daughters also, my wife and daughters came to Stanford for the memorial service. And we spent a fair amount of time with Martha. We were at her house the whole afternoon and the next morning, just visiting with her and stuff.
Tell me something. Obviously, you're a strong Catholic, and obviously René was a strong Catholic, and obviously there was a love that you had for René, that you asked René and Martha to be the godparents of your daughter. Did René have an impact on your Catholicism and your Catholic faith at all?
Yeah, he did. I've always been, I mean, yeah, I was raised in a Catholic family. And I've always been a very strong Catholic. And in that sense, he didn't strengthen that in the sense that it was never that weak. But he certainly helped me to really have more confidence in the faith, more confidence as a Catholic intellectual, that we really do have something to offer to society, to academia, and that we shouldn't be shy about that. We don't need to be strident either, but And in that sense, both his own bearing, his own confidence, but also, I'm, sometimes when you read him, there is a more polemical tone or a more strident tone. I never found it in personal dealings with him. Even when we spoke about people we might disagree with, I always found him very he just had an equilibrium about it all. That even in church matters, he didn't seem to. I wouldn't really identify him with right or left myself. I just didn't feel a strong, oh, he's really a conservative Catholic, or oh, he's really a liberal Catholic. That didn't seem to be what interested him. And so that I found very congenial to my own view of things.
What kind of a person did he strike you as in these years that you knew him? His personality, his persona?
So I would have first got to know him a little bit after 2000. So he was already an older man, retired. And I think I talked about a little bit just a few minutes ago. The word light comes to me, both an illumination and a lack of heaviness. And for me, there are a number of stories, but one that has always stayed with me was at the colloquium on violence and religion. And so the fact that we call it that, the colloquium, the speaking, it was the one that was held in Ottawa, and he was going to be interviewed by the Canadian Broadcast Company, and there was some sort of delay setting up the equipment. So he's kind of just standing there in the hallway, a little bit lost. Martha wasn't around. And I stopped to chat with him, and he said, yeah, I'm waiting for this. So I said, well, let's sit down. And so we did. We sat there more or less in the hallway, kind of an alcove, and just started chatting. And I don't really remember much of the content, but someone walked by and saw us and said, oh, is it okay if I sit down? And of course, and then someone else came by and said, well, can I join you? And it gradually grew to a group of about 12 or 15 people sitting in kind of a large circle, just having a very pleasant conversation about, was dealing with his thought, different and again, I don't really remember the content, but what I remember is the tone and the atmosphere. And you had a number of different people. You had people like Andrew McKenna, who had already knew René for years and years, and you had new people who were kind of just like in awe. Can I sit down? and eventually everyone just got comfortable, not just with René, but with each other. And I just marveled at it, that he was, without doing anything, he was able to do this, bring a group of people together like that and let them have a conversation. And he was only dominant in the sense that people wanted to hear from him.
Right.
And in that sense, then he spoke more than others, but not in the sense that he wasn't more than willing to listen to what others had to say. I think that humility was part of what drew my wife, to him, was just, here's this great man, who seems to be very friendly and nice, and, kind of she was just very pleased with that.
Good. Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Alberg, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, I look forward to